The moment you stopped chasing, something they never prepared for quietly began to unfold inside them. Your silence didn't end the connection. It exposed everything they were never ready to face. You need to hear this because very few people ever recognize it while it is happening. The exact moment you stopped going after them, something shifted inside their awareness almost instantly, but not in a calm or neutral way. It did not land as relief, and it was not brushed off as unimportant. Instead, it hit them with a strange, unsettling awareness that disturbed their inner thoughts more than they expected, almost like a subtle disruption in their internal emotional balance. When your pursuit ended, it was not just a simple change in behavior they could logically register and move past. It triggered something deeper inside them, something instinctive rather than rational. The person you once invested your energy into begins to experience a quiet, internal disturbance that slowly pulls apart their sense of certainty, especially the certainty they had about your availability, your attention, and your emotional presence. What once felt stable in their perception now becomes uncertain, and the mind does not remain neutral in uncertainty. It begins to analyze, question, and fill gaps it does not understand. What they suddenly feel is a kind of space where your attention used to be, a gap they never consciously paid attention to before, but now it feels wide, unfamiliar, and almost uncomfortable in its silence. They are not emotionally equipped for that kind of stillness, so their mind reacts before they even understand what is happening. Confusion builds into tension, and that tension slowly turns into inner unease that lingers in the background of their thoughts. Your absence does not register as true absence in their perception. It behaves more like a reflective surface, forcing them to see aspects of themselves they previously ignored or never had to confront. Somewhere within that silence, they recognize that the sense of influence or importance they believed they had over you is no longer active. That realization does not come as a single clear thought, but as a gradual emotional collapse of assumption. And when that internal certainty disappears, their emotional stability begins to shake in subtle but persistent ways, creating a quiet psychological discomfort they cannot easily name or dismiss. From that point onward, their inner world becomes increasingly unsettled. They cannot clearly explain what they feel, yet they cannot ignore it either, which creates a loop of unresolved mental noise in the background. Thoughts begin to repeat themselves, especially the ones they usually suppress or avoid when everything feels stable. Doubt mixes with discomfort, and buried insecurities start surfacing without permission or warning. At the same time, they begin questioning their own intentions and emotional motives, whether their attachment was truly about you as a person or about the way you made them feel valued, seen, or significant in their own identity. Now that your presence is no longer available to reinforce that emotional reflection, the internal structure they relied on begins to weaken. Their conscious mind tries to maintain control and rational explanation, but emotionally they feel divided between resistance and fear. That division creates instability, not dramatic on the outside, but persistent and consuming on the inside. As the distance continues, imagination starts filling in the gaps your absence created. They begin picturing your life without them more vividly than they would ever openly admit. They see you moving forward, laughing, engaging, existing in moments where they are no longer included, and their mind keeps returning to those images even when they try to move on. And this is where the emotional response becomes more complex than simple longing. Alongside missing you, there is frustration, irritation, ego resistance, and even guilt that they cannot fully process or organize into something understandable. These emotions do not arrive in a structured way. They surface in unpredictable waves that influence mood, thought patterns, and sometimes even impulsive reactions. The human mind resists unfinished emotional situations, and your silence creates exactly that, something unresolved, something open-ended. The absence of closure becomes mentally louder than any argument or rejection ever could, because the mind continues searching for meaning where none is given. Over time, the image they held of themselves in relation to you begins to break down. The version of them that once felt in control of the dynamic no longer feels stable or believable under the weight of your absence. As that internal image weakens, hidden emotions and suppressed truths start rising closer to the surface, things they never had to face when your attention was still present. Even the calm exterior they try to maintain does not match the internal turbulence they are experiencing, creating a quiet disconnect between appearance and inner reality. Your silence becomes the center point of their inner conflict, something they cannot fully escape or resolve because there is nothing concrete to respond to, only absence. Thoughts of you return repeatedly, not because they consciously choose them, but because the mind naturally fixates on unfinished emotional patterns that remain unresolved. And beneath all of it lies a truth they struggle to admit even internally. Absence often creates more psychological pressure than direct rejection because it leaves the mind searching endlessly for answers that never arrive. Rejection has a clear structure to it. It has edges, meaning, and definition. You can name it, understand it, and eventually process it like something finished. But absence is different. Absence has no shape. It feels like unfinished space, open, undefined, and filled with whatever fears the mind chooses to project into it. And this is where the situation begins to shift in a more psychologically intense direction, because the mind does not stay neutral in undefined space. It tries to complete it, even if it has to invent meaning to do so. They start paying attention to things they previously ignored without effort: small delays in replies, moments of silence, brief pauses in communication. Everything begins to feel amplified as if it carries hidden significance. Even the slightest withdrawal of your attention starts registering like something meaningful, something that needs decoding or interpretation. Their mind goes back through old interactions, replaying moments that once felt ordinary and unimportant. A casual joke where they were not the center of attention, a glance you gave someone else, a message you didn't respond to immediately. None of it mattered before, but now everything feels loaded with possible meaning. As if the past has become a puzzle they are suddenly trying to solve with incomplete pieces. And as these memories repeat, their mind attempts to organize internal chaos into patterns. Even when no real pattern exists, it constructs one anyway, because uncertainty is more difficult to tolerate than discomfort. The human mind struggles far more with not knowing than with emotional pain itself, and your distance places them directly inside that unresolved uncertainty. Naturally, this triggers a quiet but persistent fear. What if they misread you? What if they underestimated your value, your emotional depth, or your significance in their life? What if they failed to appreciate something important while they still had access to it? These thoughts do not arrive gently. They surface like unresolved echoes that refuse to settle, repeating until they demand attention. Most people don't realize this, but the mind does not accept emotional loss passively. It actively searches for ways to regain control or restore a sense of predictability. And when no clear resolution is available, it begins constructing its own explanations to reduce internal discomfort. It creates stories, alternate outcomes, imagined conversations, anything that temporarily softens the tension of not knowing. At first, this shows up subtly, a sudden urge to reach out, a passing curiosity about what you are doing now, a brief emotional pull that feels hard to explain. Then it deepens into repetition. Thought loops, emotional flashbacks, imagined scenarios where things are corrected, reversed, or repaired in a way that restores psychological balance. As time continues, regret becomes more intense and harder to suppress, not because something new is happening externally, but because internally their sense of control is weakening. Beneath that regret is a deeper realization forming, the understanding that influence, charm, or assumption no longer work the way they once did. That realization is difficult for the mind to tolerate because it creates a direct confrontation with powerlessness, and the ego resists that state instinctively. This is where emotional instability often begins to surface. Fear of loss mixes with pride. Desire conflicts with embarrassment. Guilt collides with attachment. They begin shifting between opposing emotional states, wanting closeness in one moment and resisting it in the next. One part of them longs to reconnect, while another part feels threatened by the intensity of what they feel. The internal contradiction becomes exhausting even if it remains unspoken, because it unfolds entirely within their inner world rather than in visible behavior. And the unsettling truth is that very little was actually done on your side. You simply stopped chasing. But that single behavioral shift disrupted a deeper psychological pattern they were unconsciously relying on. It exposed parts of their inner world they usually avoid: vulnerability, insecurity, and the uncomfortable awareness of emotional dependence. These are the parts people rarely confront directly because they challenge the self-image they prefer to maintain, especially the belief that they are unaffected or in control. Most people try to escape this discomfort quickly. They distract themselves, rationalize it, or minimize its importance. But this type of emotional pressure doesn't disappear through logic alone. It lingers, quietly influencing thoughts, moods, and behavioral impulses. And as long as your absence continues, that pressure does not simply reset. It gradually accumulates, reinforcing the internal tension rather than dissolving it. Over time, they begin noticing you differently, not as someone actively pursuing them, but as someone continuing forward without needing their validation or response. That shift changes everything internally. What once felt available now feels uncertain. What once felt stable now feels unpredictable. And with that uncertainty comes a slow realization they can no longer ignore. Your attention was never guaranteed, and your presence was never something they truly controlled, only something they assumed would remain consistent. From there, the mind keeps circling the same questions: what went wrong? What could have been done differently? Whether anything can still be repaired? But these questions rarely bring clarity. They only deepen the loop as memory, imagination, and regret begin blending together into a single unresolved mental space. Meanwhile, your silence continues in the background, not dramatic, not reactive, but consistent. And that consistency is what reshapes the dynamic. It removes old assumptions, breaks familiar expectations, and introduces a form of emotional uncertainty that cannot be easily resolved through logic or action. So they remain caught between opposing forces, reaching out and holding back, pride and longing, fear and desire, certainty and confusion. And beneath all of it, one realization slowly becomes unavoidable. They are no longer operating within a dynamic they can predict, control, or comfortably assume will resolve itself in their favor. The silence they once brushed off has now become the most overwhelming presence in their inner world. It is no longer background noise. It feels like something constantly echoing, pressing against every thought. Every unanswered question seems to linger longer. Every memory carries a heavier emotional charge than before, and as each day passes, they are forced into a quiet confrontation with emotions they previously pushed away or never fully examined. What began with your simple decision to stop chasing has expanded into something far more internal and unavoidable for them. It is no longer just about distance between two people. It has become a confrontation with themselves. What they avoided, what they assumed, and what they never questioned while the dynamic was still active. Somewhere within that silence, they begin to sense that what they once took lightly may not return in the same form again, and that possibility settles into their thoughts like an unresolved weight. In that mental space, imagination starts to fill the gaps. They begin constructing scenarios they never expected to consider, thoughts of regaining influence, reconnecting, or somehow restoring what feels lost. At times, even a subtle desire for emotional rebalancing appears, where pride quietly seeks resolution. But beneath all of this lies a deeper realization they are only beginning to face. You were never something they could fully direct, define, or control. And that truth does not sit comfortably with them. This is where the internal shift deepens. Even if they are not fully aware of it, their mind begins reacting in subtle but persistent ways. The tension shows up physically: unease, restlessness, sudden waves of anxiety without clear cause. Emotionally, it expands into something harder to ignore. It is no longer just thought, it becomes felt experience. Your absence stops being nothing and starts functioning like a psychological mirror they cannot easily turn away from. In that reflection, they begin to see aspects of themselves they usually avoid acknowledging: their need for validation, their hidden dependence on emotional certainty, and the discomfort they feel when they are no longer the center of someone's attention. For a long time, they may have held onto an internal image of independence or control, but your silence quietly disrupts that narrative without any confrontation or argument. This is what makes silence powerful. It does not argue. It does not explain. It simply removes participation from the pattern, and in doing so, it forces the other person to sit alone with what remains unresolved inside them. As that internal pressure builds, emotions begin to surface in conflicting ways. Desire and resistance appear at the same time. Longing is mixed with anxiety. Curiosity is tangled with pride. They may find themselves reaching for their phone, pausing before acting, then withdrawing again. That hesitation is not random. It reflects an internal split between what they feel and what they are willing to admit. And beneath it all, the mind begins doing what it always does when faced with uncertainty. It tries to create meaning. It replays conversations. It reinterprets past moments. It searches for hidden signals in things that once felt ordinary. But instead of clarity, this often produces more confusion because the answers it seeks no longer exist in the present moment. Meanwhile, your continued absence reinforces a new reality they cannot fully ignore. The dynamic they relied on is no longer active. Old assumptions no longer apply. And the emotional certainty they once had is gradually replaced with unpredictability. That unpredictability becomes the real source of discomfort. Not just the loss of connection, but the loss of control over how the story unfolds. Over time, this leads to a deeper psychological shift. You are no longer perceived in the same passive way. Instead, your independence becomes more visible to them, your life continuing without them, your emotional self-sufficiency, your detachment from old patterns, all of it begins to register more intensely than before. And each new realization adds another layer to their internal tension. They start to understand something they previously did not have to face. Your attention was never guaranteed, and your presence was never something they could permanently secure. That realization does not arrive as a single moment. It builds gradually through absence, silence, and the inability to reset what once existed. As a result, the mind continues cycling through questions that do not resolve easily. What changed? What was missed? Could anything be repaired? But instead of bringing peace, these questions tend to deepen the loop. Memory and imagination begin to blur together, and emotional interpretation takes over where certainty used to be. And still, your silence remains steady. Not forceful, not dramatic, just consistent. That consistency is what transforms everything. It breaks expectation. It removes familiarity. It introduces emotional space where old patterns no longer function. Within that space, they are left navigating opposing internal forces: attachment and pride, fear and desire, hope and hesitation. One part of them wants connection, while another resists vulnerability. One part reaches outward, while another pulls back in self-protection. This internal contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. And slowly, something becomes clear beneath all the emotional noise. They are no longer experiencing the comfort of control they once assumed was there. Instead, they are left facing uncertainty about you, about the past, and about themselves. That is the real impact of absence. Not destruction, not chaos, but exposure. A quiet stripping away of assumptions until only unresolved truth remains, waiting to be understood without distraction or illusion. In the end, what unfolds inside them is not just about missing you. It is about meeting themselves in a way they were never prepared for. Your silence does not argue, explain, or demand anything. It simply removes your energy from a dynamic they had grown used to, and in that removal, something undeniable begins to surface. All the assumptions they built around control, certainty, and emotional security slowly lose their structure under the weight of absence itself. What remains is not chaos in the dramatic sense, but a quiet confrontation with their own inner world, one that feels more revealing than anything you could have said or done. They begin to understand, often uncomfortably, that your presence was never something they could permanently secure or manage. It was never fully under their influence, no matter what they believed or assumed at the time. And now that the pattern has broken, they are left sitting with the consequences of that realization, not as punishment, but as awareness, an unavoidable clarity that only distance and emotional discontinuity can create. It is the kind of understanding that does not arrive through conversation or explanation, but through absence itself, when the mind is no longer distracted by familiarity. In that space, emotions that were previously ignored or suppressed begin to rise closer to the surface. Regret, longing, pride, fear, and uncertainty overlap and collide, making it difficult for them to form a stable internal narrative. They move between wanting reconnection and fearing vulnerability, between holding on to ego and being pulled toward emotional truth they are not fully ready to face. This internal conflict does not resolve quickly because it is not a logical problem. It is an attachment-based disruption, and attachment does not respond cleanly to reasoning or control. Meanwhile, your absence continues to function as a steady reminder that the old dynamic no longer exists. The familiar certainty they once relied on has been replaced by unpredictability, and in that unpredictability, the mind does what it naturally does under pressure. It searches for meaning, patterns, and explanations, even when none fully resolve the emotional weight of what is being felt. The thinking becomes repetitive, not because answers are close, but because uncertainty itself has become the dominant experience. But beneath all of that mental activity, a deeper shift is happening. They are beginning to see you differently, not as someone within reach by default, but as someone who continued forward without needing permission, validation, or return. That realization carries its own emotional impact. It challenges assumptions not only about you, but about themselves and how they understood connection, control, and emotional influence in relationships. What once felt stable in interpretation now feels less certain, and that uncertainty cannot easily be unseen. Eventually, what they are left with is not just thoughts about you, but thoughts about their own inner state. Your silence becomes a reflection they cannot easily avoid. It reveals dependence they did not fully acknowledge, attachment they underestimated, and emotional needs they may have rationalized away. And in that reflection, they are pushed into a form of self-awareness that does not rely on external input. It comes from absence and therefore feels harder to dismiss. Some will resist it. Some will try to escape it. Some will attempt to reassert control by rewriting the story internally or minimizing what they feel. But none of those responses fully erase what has already been uncovered. Once someone becomes aware of their own emotional patterns without distraction, they cannot completely return to the earlier version of certainty they once operated from. Something has already shifted in how they perceive themselves and the dynamic they were part of. And so the conclusion is not simply about loss or separation. It is about exposure, the quiet dismantling of assumed control, and the emergence of what was always present beneath it. Your silence did not create confusion. It removed interference. And in that removal, what was hidden by routine, familiarity, and expectation becomes visible enough to be felt, even if not fully understood. What remains is a realization they cannot easily dismiss. The connection was never only about pursuit or distance. It was about what surfaces when pursuit ends and what is revealed when attention is no longer filling the space between two people. And in that ending, both sides are altered in different ways, one through detachment and the other through confrontation with what was always there, but never fully acknowledged.